They called him the Ghost of Whispering Ridge. They said his face was a map of hell itself, a twisted ruin that would curdle fresh milk and make children scream in the night. The townsfolk of Bitter Creek didn't just fear Elias Thorne. They loathed him. They laughed when the desperate mail-order bride from Chicago stepped off the train and took his calloused hand. They placed bets on how long she'd last up there in that silent, frozen cabin with a monster. "She'll be running back by sundown," the mayor had sneered, spitting tobacco onto the frozen mud. "Or she'll be buried by dawn." But they didn't know Elias. They didn't know what lay beneath the scars, or the silent promise he had made to the land. And they certainly didn't know his secret. When the sky turned black and the great white death descended on Wyoming, when the cattle froze into statues of ice and the rich men in town were burning their furniture to stay alive, the laughter stopped. Because when the world ended, the monster on the ridge was the only one ready for the apocalypse. And the secret he was hiding? It wouldn't just silence their mockery. It would decide who lived and who died. Before we step into the snow and uncover the truth of Whispering Ridge, I have a challenge for you. If you believe that true beauty is found in the heart and not the face, hit that like button right now. Let's see if we can get 1,000 likes for the outcasts who saved the day. Make sure you are subscribed and have that notification bell rung so you never miss a tale of frontier survival. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Are you safe and warm?
Let me know!
Now let's head to Wyoming, November 1886. The wind in Wyoming didn't just blow, it hunted. That was the first thought that crossed Clara Vance's mind as she stepped onto the platform at Bitter Creek. It was late November, 1886, and the air already tasted like iron and ice. Clara was 24 years old, but her eyes held the weary shadow of someone who had lived a dozen lifetimes of trouble. Chicago had been a fire that consumed her family, her father lost to the factory mills, her mother to consumption, leaving her with nothing but a debt she couldn't pay and a reputation she couldn't salvage in the unforgiving city. This desolate stretch of the territories was her last desperate gamble. She was a mail-order bride, sold on the promise of a home and safety, clutching a crumbled letter from a man she had never met. The station master, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too many harsh winters, spat tobacco juice onto the frozen planks as he looked her over. He noted her thin shoes, useless for this country, and the way she shivered. "You the one for Thorne?" he asked, his voice dripping with something that wasn't quite pity, but close to it. "I am," Clara said, lifting her chin. She refused to let him see her tremble, though the thin wool of her coat offered no defense against the biting cold. "Is Mr. Thorne here?" The station master chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, he's here. He's always lurking at the edge of things. Just brace yourself, miss. Elias Thorne aren't exactly the welcoming committee." Clara turned to follow his gaze. At the far end of the platform, away from the huddle of townsfolk who were loading supplies of flour and coffee, stood a wagon. It was sturdy, well-maintained, pulled by two massive draft horses that looked like they could tow a mountain. But the man holding the reins was the reason the crowd kept its distance. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a heavy buffalo coat that swallowed his frame, a necessity in a land where frostbite could claim a man's fingers in minutes. As Clara approached, he turned his head, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The left side of his face was handsome, with a jawline cut from granite and an eye the color of storm clouds. But the right side was a ruin. Shiny, twisted ridges of scar tissue ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent, rigid grimace. It was a burn scar, violent and old. The whispers she had heard on the train came rushing. Back, the monster of Bitter Creek, the man who burned his own family, the recluse. Clara stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. The townsfolk had stopped their work to watch. She could feel their eyes, hungry for her reaction. They wanted her to scream. They wanted her to run. It was the social currency of the small town. Gossip was the only entertainment they had. Elias Thorne didn't speak. He simply watched her with that one good, intense eye. He didn't apologize for his face. He didn't hide it. He waited. It was the stoicism of the cowboy, a language of silence where words were saved for what mattered. Clara looked at the town, the muddy street, the saloon with its peeling paint where piano music drifted out, the mocking faces of the men loitering by the general store. She thought of the sweatshops in Chicago, the hunger, the hopelessness. Then she looked back at the scarred man. In his eye, she didn't see cruelty. She saw a terrifying, abyssal loneliness. She took a breath that froze in her lungs, walked up to the wagon, and tossed her carpet bag into the back. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice steady. "Are we going, Mr. Thorne?" A ripple of shock went through the onlookers. Elias blinked, perhaps the only sign of surprise he would allow. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. "Elias," he rasped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding under a heavy boot, unused and rough. "Climb up. Storm's coming." As they rode out of town, the laughter started. It began as a murmur and grew into jeers. "Best sleep with one eye open, darling," shouted a drunken cowboy. "Don't let him light any fires," laughed another. The mayor, a rotund man named Josiah Prendergast, who owned the bank and most of the cattle in the valley, watched them go with a smirk. Prendergast was the epitome of the new breed of cattle baron, men who ranched from ledgers, not from the saddle. "That girl won't last a week," Prendergast told his associates. "And when she runs, or when he finally snaps, I'll take that land of his." Whispering Ridge has the best water rights in the county, and it's wasted on a freak. Elias didn't flinch at the insults. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his gloved hands steady on the leather reins. But Clara noticed his knuckles were white. The journey to the cabin took hours. They climbed higher into the foothills, leaving the brown plains for the timberline. The air grew thinner, sharper. The wind howled through the canyons. A mournful sound that gave Whispering Ridge its name. Clara sat stiffly beside him, the cold seeping into her bones. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly after miles of silence. "In your letters. You spoke of the ranch. You spoke of the books you read. You never said that I was a monster." Elias finished for her. He didn't look at her. "If I told you, would you have come?" Clara hesitated. Honesty was all she had left. "No," she whispered. "I probably wouldn't have." "Then that is why," he said simply. "I needed a wife." "Clara, the law says a man needs a wife to claim the full homestead. Expansion under the new act, and the house is quiet. Too quiet." "Is it true?" she asked, the fear creeping back in. Did you do this to yourself? Did you hurt people?" Elias pulled the horses to a stop. They were at the crest of a ridge. Below them, nestled in a sheltered bowl against the mountain, sat a cabin. It wasn't the shack she expected. It was a fortress of logs and stone, solid and defiant against the gray sky. It was built low to the ground, with a sod roof that would insulate against the worst freezes. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the pain behind the stoicism. "Fire takes, Clara. It took my parents. It took my brother. It took my face. I didn't set it. But I survived it. And around here, survival is a sin if you don't look pretty doing it." He clicked his tongue at the horses. "We're home. Don't expect kindness from me. I have forgotten how to give it. You keep the house, I work the land. That is the bargain." Clara looked at the scarred profile of her new husband, then down at the sturdy cabin that stood alone against the wilderness. It was a prison, or perhaps a sanctuary. She didn't know which yet. But as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the leaden sky, marking the beginning of a winter history would never forget, Clara knew one thing: she was done running. "Deal," she said. The first month at Whispering Ridge was a lesson in silence. The cabin was sturdy, far warmer than the drafty tenements of Chicago, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Elias was a ghost in his own home. He would wake before dawn, the sound of the heavy iron latch lifting the only signal that he was leaving. He would return long after dark, smelling of pine pitch, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of the coming snow. Clara threw herself into the domestic war against the grime of bachelorhood. She scrubbed the floors with sand and lye until the wood gleamed. She beat the dust out of the heavy buffalo robes. She cooked with the meager supplies: beans, salt pork, and dried apples. But in her cleaning, she found his library, a shocking collection of leather-bound volumes. Shakespeare, Plato, agricultural treatises on soil chemistry and irrigation. It was the first crack in his armor. The monster read philosophy by candlelight, but the town of Bitter Creek was not content to let them be. 2 weeks after her arrival, Clara took the wagon down into town for supplies while Elias was mending fences in the high pasture. She needed flour and coffee, arbuckles, with the peppermint stick inside. And perhaps, she admitted to herself, the sound of another human voice. It was a mistake. As she entered the general store, conversation died. The silence was heavy, judgmental. Mayor Prendergast was there, warming his backside by the potbelly stove. He tipped his expensive beaver felt hat, but his eyes were cold. "Mrs. Thorne," he drawled. "Surprised to see you. We had a pool going. I wagered you'd be halfway to St. Louis by now."
"I am not going anywhere, Mr. Mayor," Clara said,
keeping her voice steady as she handed her list to the clerk. "A shame," Prendergast sighed. "You're a fine-looking woman. A waste, really. You know that land of his? It's cursed. Just like him. The Indians say bad spirits live in that canyon. And Elias? Well, everyone knows he's hoarding. He buys more grain and salt than a man with 50 head of cattle needs. What's he building up there? A kingdom for the damned? He works hard," Clara defended, surprising herself. "He prepares." "Prepares?" Prendergast laughed. "For what? It's a mild winter. The almanac says so. The investors in the East say so. My herds are out on the open range, thousands of them, grazing on the best grass we've seen in years. Your husband is a paranoid fool, hoarding supplies like a squirrel. Tell him I made an offer on the land, a generous one. Tell him to sell before the winter drives you both mad." Prendergast represented the hubris of the era. The cattle boom had convinced men they could conquer nature with math. They believed the grass was endless and the winters were manageable. Elias knew better. Clara bought her flour and left, her cheeks burning. But Prendergast's words gnawed at her. Hoarding. When she returned to the ridge, she didn't go straight to the house. She followed the fresh tracks of Elias's sled. They led away from the barn, toward the back of the canyon where the rock-faced Cheryl dropped off. She had never ventured that far. Elias had told her the terrain was treacherous. She found him there, and what she saw stopped her dead in her tracks. Elias wasn't just mending fences. He was building a fortress. He had fenced off the deep, narrow box canyon at the back of the property, a natural cul-de-sac, protected from the wind by towering granite walls. Inside, he was stacking hay. Not just piles, but mountains of it. He had reinforced a natural cave system with timber, creating massive insulated shelters. And there were cattle there. Not his small herd of 50, but hundreds. Strays. Mavericks he must have rounded up from the high country. "What is this?" Clara asked, stepping out from the trees. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt before he recognized her. He relaxed, but his expression darkened. "I told you the footing was bad here." "You're hiding cattle," she said. "And Prendergast said you're hoarding grain." "Why, Elias?" "The winter is supposed to be mild." Elias looked up at the sky. It was a pale, bruised purple, the color of a fresh bruise. "Prendergast listens to bankers in the East who have never seen a Wyoming sky turn that color. I listen to the land." He walked over to a rock face and brushed off a layer of moss. "The beavers are building their lodges double thick this year. The bark on the aspens is tougher than iron. The white owls have come down from the Arctic 2 months early. That only happens when the North is emptying out." He turned his scarred face to her. And for the first time, Clara saw not fear or anger, but a desperate burning intensity. "The great die-up is coming, Clara. I can feel it in my bones. The old-timers talk about the winter of 60, but this will be worse. Prendergast and the others, they have overstocked the range. Too many cows, not enough grass. When the snow comes, and it stays, their herds will have nowhere to go. They will drift against the drift fences and freeze by the thousands." He gestured to the sheltered canyon. "This is thermal. There are hot springs in the caves. The ground stays warm. I've been stockpiling hay for 3 years. Not for greed, for life. These creatures, they depend on us." Clara looked at the massive preparations, the work of one man, alone, driven by a secret knowledge everyone else mocked. She realized then that his paranoia was actually a profound, silent stewardship. He was practicing what the old homesteaders called Liebig's Law, that survival is determined not by the abundance of summer, but by the scarcity of winter. "They call you a monster," she said softly. "Let them," Elias grunted, turning back to his work. "Dead men don't laugh." "I can help," Clara said. She stepped forward and grabbed a pitchfork. Elias paused. He looked at her small hands, then at her determined eyes. A strange softness entered his good eye. "It's heavy work, Clara." "I carried my father up 3 flights of stairs when he was sick," she said. "I know heavy." For the first time since she arrived, the corner of Elias's mouth, the unscarred side, twitched upward. "All right then," he said. "Toss it high." We need to fill the loft before the sun goes down." That night, they ate dinner in a companionable silence. But the wind outside was changing. It was no longer just blowing. It was screaming. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. The glass in the windows began to frost over on the inside. The shadow of Whispering Ridge had prepared. But even Elias Thorne didn't know that the storm coming wasn't just a blizzard. It was a white hurricane. It began on January 9th, 1887, history. Books would record it as the day the West froze. But for Clara and Elias, it was the day the world disappeared. The snow didn't just fall. It was driven horizontally by 60-mile-an-hour winds, sharper than glass. In the first 24 hours, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The cabin groaned under the assault, the heavy timbers creaking like a ship in a typhoon. Inside, the cold was a living thing. It seeped through the chinking in the logs, turning the water in the bucket to solid ice within feet of the roaring fireplace. Clara and Elias moved their mattress into the kitchen, the smallest room, sleeping in shifts to keep the fire fed. They burned buffalo chips and dried corn cobs when the woodpile ran low, the acrid smoke filling the small space. If the fire died, they died. It was that simple. On the third day, the noise stopped. Not the wind, that still raged, but the light. The snow had drifted entirely over the windows, burying the cabin. They were entombed. "We have to check the stock," Elias said, pulling on his buffalo coat. He wrapped scarves around his face until only his eyes were visible. "You can't go out there," Clara cried, grabbing his arm. "You'll be lost in 3 steps. The drifts are 10 feet high." I ran a guide rope to the barn and the canyon entrance. Elias shouted over the muffled roar, "If I don't break the ice on the troughs, they die. If I don't throw hay, they die." He opened the door and a wall of white collapsed into the room. He fought his way out, disappearing instantly. Clara threw her weight against the door to latch it, then waited. 10 minutes, 20, an hour. Panic began to claw at her throat. She paced the small room, the firelight dancing on the walls. She thought of his scars. Fire had marked him, and now ice was trying to claim him. "I am a widow," she thought. "I am a widow in a tomb." Then a thud against the door. She threw the latch. Elias fell in, covered in ice, his eyebrows frozen white. He dragged something behind him, a calf, stiff and barely breathing. "Found him. Near the gate," Elias gasped, collapsing by the fire. "Too small." Mother froze. Clara sprang into action. She grabbed towels, rubbing the calf's limbs, forcing circulation back. Elias lay on the floor, his chest heaving. He watched her work, watched her fight for the small life with the same ferocity he possessed. "You're good at this," he murmured, his voice slurring from hypothermia. "Stay awake, Elias," she ordered, slapping his cheek lightly. "Don't you dare sleep." They spent the night huddled together under the buffalo robes, the calf between them, sharing their body warmth. For the first time, Elias held her. Not out of duty, but out of necessity, and perhaps something more. He was shivering violently. Clara wrapped her arms around his broad chest, pressing her face against his scarred shoulder. "Why did you save the calf?" she whispered in the dark. "It's just one." "Because everything else out there is dead," Elias whispered back. "Pendergast's herds." "They're gone, Clara. I saw them. Drifted against the south fence. Heaps of them. Frozen solid standing up. It's a graveyard." The storm raged for 2 weeks. The diaries of the time speak of people burning their furniture, even their flooring, just to survive the nights. When the wind finally died down, silence returned. A terrifying absolute silence. Elias dug a tunnel out of the front door. When they emerged, the world was unrecognizable. The landscape was a flat, blinding sheet of white. The fences were gone. The trees were gone, buried. But from the hidden box canyon behind the ridge, a sound arose. A low, warm sound, mooing. Elias's preparations had held. The thermal vents in the cave and the high rock walls had created a pocket of survival. His herd was alive. But as they stood there, blinking in the harsh sunlight, they saw something moving on the horizon. Dark specks against the white snow. Men, walking. It wasn't a rescue party. It was a mob. Leading them was Mayor Prendergast, wrapped in furs but looking gaunt. Behind him were a dozen men from town, ranchers, cowhands, fathers. They were stumbling, desperate, their horses dead or unable to traverse the drifts. They were walking toward the only smoke they could see. "They're coming for the food," Elias said, his hand dropping to the Colt peacemaker on his hip. "They're starving and desperate men do terrible things." Elias, Clara said, touching his hand. They laughed at us? Yes. They wished us dead? Yes. Elias looked at the approaching men, then at his thriving herd. Then at Clara, his scar twisted in the bright light. I have enough ammo to stop them. I have the high ground. It's my food, my work. Clara looked at the mob. She saw the station master. She saw the young cowboy who had jeered at her. She also saw the town doctor and the father of the boy she had seen playing in the street. You're right, Clara said softly. You could stop them. You could be the monster they think you are. She paused, looking deep into his good eye. Or you can be the man I know you are. Elias stared at her for a long moment. The wind ruffled his hair. Slowly he took his hand off his gun. Put the coffee on, Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion, and bake everything we have. It's going to be a long day. The men stopped 20 yards from the cabin. They looked like wraiths, their faces hollowed by hunger and cold. Prendergast stepped forward, a rifle in his hands. He looked at Elias, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the smell of fresh bread wafting from the open door. Thorn, Prendergast croaked. We need supplies. The town is cut off. The train hasn't come in 3 weeks. The store is empty. My cattle are all dead. I know, Elias said calmly. We're taking what you have, a cowboy shouted from the back, racking the slide of his Winchester. We know you've got food hoarded up here, you miserly freak. Elias stepped off the porch. The snow crunched loudly under his boot. He walked straight toward Prendergast. The mayor raised his rifle, his hands shaking. Stay back! I'll shoot! Elias didn't stop until the barrel was pressing against his chest. He looked down at the trembling mayor. You called me a monster, Josiah. You said I was crazy for building shelters. You said I was wasting money on hay. Prendergast stammered. If I was the monster you say I am, Elias said, his voice carrying across the silent snow, I'd let you freeze right here. I'd watch you starve, and then in the spring, I'd buy your land for pennies on the dollar, just like you planned to do to me. The silence stretched heavy and sharp as a knife blade. Clara stepped out onto the porch, holding a steaming basket of biscuits. But, Elias continued, my wife says we have guests. Elias reached out and gently pushed the rifle barrel aside. Put the guns down. Go to the barn. There's a steer butchered and hanging. Take what you can carry. There's hay for what horses you have left. Prendergast stared at him, his mouth agape. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a crushing shame. He looked at the scar on Elias's face, the mark he had mocked 1,000 times, and realized that the only thing monstrous about Elias Thorne was the size of his mercy. Elias, Prendergast whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. We don't deserve this. No, Elias agreed. You don't, but your children do. And Clara, she has a soft spot for strays. The men lowered their guns. Some wept openly. They filed past Elias, not meeting his eyes, humbled by the man they had scorned. But the secret wasn't just the food. As the men loaded the meat and hay, Elias waved Prendergast over to the ridge. Come here, look. He pointed down into the box canyon. The steam from the hot springs rose into the frosty air. Below, hundreds of cattle huddled together, warm and chewing on the stockpile of hay. My God, Prendergast breathed. They're alive. All of them. Not all of them, Elias corrected. Look closer. Prendergast squinted. Among the thorn brand, he saw other markings. The Circle J, the Bar T, and Prendergast's own double diamond. I opened the drift fences before the storm hit, Elias said quietly. I knew your herds would drift south with the wind. I set flares to guide them into the canyon. About 200 of your head followed mine in. Prendergast fell to his knees in the snow. Elias hadn't just saved the townspeople. He had saved their future. He had saved the breeding stock that would allow the town to rebuild when the snow melted. He had saved them from total ruin. This was the ultimate pivot of the great die-up, while the barons lost everything. The smallholders who lived with the land, not on it, were the ones who endured. Why? Prendergast asked, looking up at the scarred recluse. Why save my cattle? I tried to ruin you. Elias looked back at the cabin, where Clara was pouring coffee for the frozen men. Because this land tries to kill us every day, Josiah. It doesn't care if you're a mayor or a monster. We only survive if we stand together. I learned that in the fire. It seems you just learned it in the ice. The winter of 1887 broke the back of the cattle barons. The great die-up changed the West forever. The open range was fenced off. The era of the cowboy king was over. But in Bitter Creek, something else had changed. When the spring thaw finally came, bringing the Chinook winds that melted the drifts, the road to Whispering Ridge was packed, not with angry mobs, but with wagons bearing gifts. A new plow, a sack of sugar, a bolt of fine blue silk for Clara. They left them on the porch, often without a word, acts of penance from a town that had learned its lesson. Elias Thorne was no longer the ghost. He was still quiet. He still preferred the company of his books and his wife to the saloon. But when he rode into town, men tipped their hats. Not out of fear, but out of a deep, reverent respect. The scar on his face hadn't changed, but the way people looked at it had. It was no longer a mark of shame. It was a badge of survival. One warm afternoon in May, Clara stood on the porch of the cabin. Her belly was round with their first child. She watched Elias down in the corral, working with a new foal. He was laughing, a rusty, unfamiliar sound, but a true one. He looked up and saw her watching him. He left the foal and walked up the hill, wiping the sweat from his brow. He stood before her, the sun illuminating both the scar and the handsome side of his face. "Prendergast was here today," Elias said, resting his hand on her stomach. "Oh?" Clara smiled, placing her hand over his. "What did the mayor want?" "He wanted to know if I'd run for town council. Said they need someone with vision." Clara laughed, the sound ringing off the canyon walls. "And what did you say?" "I told him I have all the vision I need right here." He kissed her forehead, then knelt to listen to the baby. "Besides, I have a new job, Father." Clara ran her fingers over the rigid ridges of his scar. "They don't call you a monster anymore, Elias." Elias stood up and pulled her into his arms. Looking out over the valley, green, lush, and alive with the cattle he had saved. "They can call me whatever they want," he said softly, "as long as you call me husband. They say the West was won with bullets and blood, but in Bitter Creek, it was won with a stack of hay, a hidden canyon, and the heart of a man everyone refused to see." Elias Thorne's secret wasn't his gold or his cattle. His secret was that while the world saw a beast, he had never stopped being human. And as for Clara, she never did go back to Chicago. She found something better on Whispering Ridge. She found a love that could weather the worst winter in history, and a fire that no snow could ever extinguish. What a journey. The story of Elias and Clara reminds us that sometimes the people society rejects are the very ones who hold the keys to our survival. If this story warmed your heart, please give this video a massive thumbs up. It helps us share these stories with the world. And I want to know, what would you have done if you were Elias? Would you have shared your food with the people who mocked you? Or would you have let them freeze? Be honest in the comments below. If you crave more tales of frontier grit, check out this video right here on the screen. The widow who defended her ranch against 20 outlaws. It's a wild ride you won't want to miss. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fires burning. From all of us at Frontier Rescue Stories, stay safe out there.